It's more than a science fiction writer's fad. It was literature's first real response to the information age. Its concerns were down to earth rather than stuck in space, and it coupled high tech with low life. The writer who inspired this movement is William Gibson, American-born and now living in Canada. His fourth novel, The Difference Engine, was co-written with fellow science fiction writer Bruce Sterling and is published this week. Tonight, Ben Woolley explores the imagination of the man who many see as the saviour of science fiction.
We're an information economy. They teach you that in school. What they don't tell you is that it's impossible to move, to live, to operate at any level without leaving traces, bits, seemingly meaningless fragments of personal information, fragments that can be retrieved, amplified.
I admire Gibson. Number one, he's extremely smart, and he's very sophisticated in the way a novelist should be, and he's a great writer. Most of us who love science fiction have deplored the pedestrian, lumbering, wrench and hammer style of most science fiction authors, but Gibson belongs to that new wave of post-60s, post-industrial writing that's so classy.
Space, the territory of science fiction. Once it seemed to offer limitless imaginative possibilities, but recently writers have begun to lose interest in it. Many feel they've done space, but they need another final frontier to explore. William Gibson has found them one, an uncharted realm ripe for exploration. It's the computer-generated space of the information age, cyberspace.
The Matrix has its roots in primitive arcade games, said the voiceover, in early graphics programs and military experimentation with cranial jacks. On the Sony, a two-dimensional space war faded behind a forest of mathematically generated ferns, demonstrating the spatial possibilities of logarithmic spirals. Cold blue military footage burned through, lab animals wired into test systems, helmets feeding into fire-control circuits of tanks and warplanes. Cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators. In every nation by children being taught mathematical concepts. A graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system. Cyberspace is the place in which a long-distance telephone conversation occurs. I mean, we've all been there to some minor extent. Things happen in the world of information that affect us very directly. When someone releases a computer virus, where is it? You know, really, it's in cyberspace.
How do you get there? By what Gibson calls jacking in. The body is connected to the computer via electrodes plugged direct into the central nervous system. The result is total technological immersion.
He checked the time on the kiosk Coke clock. His mother would be back from Boston by now. Had to be. Or else she'd miss one of her favorite soaps. New hole in the head. She was crazy anyway. Nothing wrong with the socket she'd had since he was born. But she'd been whining for years about static and resolution and sensory bleed over. So she'd finally swung the credit to go to Boston for some cheap-ass replacement. Kind of place where you don't even get an appointment for an operation. Walk in and they just slap it in your head. He knew her, yeah, how she'd come through the door with a wrapped bottle under her arm, not even take her coat off, just go straight over and jack into the Hitachi, soap her brains out for 6 solid hours. Her eyes would unfocus, and sometimes, if it was a really good episode, she'd drool a little. I needed a buzzword. Buzzwords are very important in science fiction, and I think I came up with cyberspace before I had the imaginary technology for it. I needed a name for a realm, for another order of being. So I sat down with a sheet of paper and literally made up a list. I can't remember the others, but they weren't memorable. That's because they weren't memorable. They weren't good buzzwords. If I'd called it data space, perhaps none of this would have happened. But cyberspace has a nice buzz to it. It's something, it's something an advertising man might have thought up. And when I got it, I thought, now that's a novel little thing. I knew that it was slick and essentially hollow, and that I'd have to fill it up with meaning. So then I had to go off and cook up the sci-fi rationale. Unthinkable complexity. Lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data, like city lights receding. There's no there. They taught that to children explaining cyberspace. No there.
Beyond exists worlds where illusions are truth things. Everything, like magic, is here in reality now.
Gibson's work is being commercially exploited like no other. Rather than make the film of the book, companies are aiming to make the world of the book. A pair of goggles, a slip-on sensory clothing accessory, and you too could be in cyberspace. We are promised not just a new technology, but a new reality.
I do believe that there's a pervasive cultural fear that we have today that we are being wrenched out of the natural world and essentially being booted into some very powerful and very artificial realm. And cyberspace excites people because it's an objectification of something that we already feel in our bones to be true. It produces the same sort of ecstasy and dread that people feel when they actually look at how they're living.
We have an interesting situation in cyberspace because it's a place that most people still don't know how to get to. And the people who can get to it are people who are computer literate. The people who can really range around rather freely in it are often people of no particularly high degree of social responsibility. So you have hackers worming their way into the NATO system and whatnot. It's like, I sometimes imagine hackers as teenagers who somehow managed to stay in the shopping mall until it's closed, and they're sort of wandering around looking in the windows. Bobby was a cowboy. Bobby was a cracksman, a burglar, casing mankind's extended electronic nervous system, rustling data and credit in the crowded matrix, monochrome non-space where the only stars are dense concentrations of information, and high above it all burned corporate galaxies and the cold spiral arms of military systems. I don't really know any hackers. I'm not part of that, not really part of that community. But when I began to write those books, I was interested in the intensity of avocation that some computer programmers seem to feel. So I think I must have decided that one could take the computer programmer and put a sort of James Dean spin on him and come up with a viable anti-hero of some kind. And it worked fairly well. It certainly gave a lot of computer programmers a new kind of swagger, as far as I can tell.
He invented this concept of the cyberpunk. Now, the cyber means pilot, and the cyberpunk is the Robin Hood, the Japanese Ronin, the free agent, the freelance, who, because of his or her wit and knowledge and technical skills, uses high technology, not for the CIA or not for the corporation, but for his or her own personal whim, personal profit, personal growth. And I think that the 60s revolution in America and in England was not a political revolution. It's a revolution about individuals who just don't want either side of the political factions. And it's a spirit of individuality that Gibson is celebrating.
I grew up in a tiny town. I grew up in a town in southwestern Virginia with about 2,000 people. Absolutely, a village, really, with nothing at all to do. And I've spent the rest of my life looking for environments with a lot going on in them, a lot of different things going on in them. And that's really what I like about cities. And to some extent, most real cities don't have enough of it to keep me happy. So I think I made up a place that had enough going on.
There's plenty going on in the sprawl. It's a vision of the city without limits. Boston, New York and Atlanta have become bloated by development to form a seamless urban zone. In Gibson's world, countries have disappeared, leaving just cities and multinationals behind.
She likes it better when they live in Moscow. Warm soup smells and subways like old palaces. But they live where the company wants her mother. Her mother has a job, but Kelsey doesn't know what it is. Something like doing television with numbers. When her mother talks about the company, Kelsey imagines a big animal. Her mother laughs, says that's right. Says the company has offices in all the big cities, but it doesn't live anywhere. Not in L.A. or Moscow or Singapore. Says that cities and companies matter now, not countries. Kelsey isn't sure what countries are. Lines on a map, colors, a concept dim as aristocracy. The thing that interests me most about the urban landscape is its unknowability. There's a sort of mystery there. There's too much to comprehend. And in a way, the sprawl for me is wishful thinking, because there aren't really, American cities aren't really like that. In a funny way, the sprawl is more like my experience of London or of Istanbul. It seems like it has a density to it that's missing in most American environments.
It's the bustle of street life that interests Gibson. The sprawl seethes with subcultures, and just as they have inspired him, so he has inspired them.
What's interesting about William Gibson, the way that he's merged all these different things, it's just like a fast-forward edit, which is, again, the same way that, I've related to in the information anxiety close. There's so much information coming at you. It's consumerist, it's, paganistic, it's technological, it's religious, it's everything you can possibly imagine just crammed into, sort of like even less than 30 seconds. Adverts used to be really long, then they got shorter and shorter, and you just have all this information flying at you, and it makes you feel, your nerves are raw, you're on edge, and it's the same feeling and the same mood. That's what William Gibson creates. And so I think when you read those books, you get that feeling, and I think that's the same feeling that I have with people that would buy the clothes, or the people that read the books, or read the comics, or go to the clubs, or play the music, or do whatever they do. It's all the same feeling, everything on overload, about to go off any minute.
Speak about the sunshine. Speak about the sunshine. Speak about the sunshine.
There was a kind of ghostly teenage DNA at work in the sprawl, something that carried the coded precepts of various short-lived subcults and replicated them at odd intervals. The Panther moderns were a soft-head variation on the scientists. If the technology had been available, the big scientists would all have had sockets stuffed with Microsofts. It was the style that mattered, and the style was the same. The moderns were mercenaries, practical jokers, nihilistic techno-fetishists.
Gibson's new book, The Difference Engine, written with Bruce Sterling, seems to turn its back on cyberpunk, but familiar themes emerge. Set in Victorian London, the book describes a steam age information revolution, one in which the scientist Charles Babbage succeeds where in reality he narrowly failed, and invents a mechanical computer.
We seized on the title Difference Engine because this was an engine that had made a difference. We really are talking about computers, and we're talking about a difference in history caused by computers. But the first difference engine was Charles Babbage's name for his pioneer steam-powered calculator. It was not binary, it was decimal. It consisted of twisting brass wheels. And he had invented it to calculate logarithms for the English Navy. But Babbage soon found that he had, in fact, invented a computer. I was interested in the computer revolution, the information revolution, which is such a sweeping change that the only real historical analogy we have for it is the Industrial Revolution. So to write a book in which the Industrial Revolution and the Information Revolution occur at the same time, to the same people and in the same historical period, that was a working model for us.
We wanted to go back and try to find that moment of supreme techno-shock and convey it. And I think the way to convey it is to go back and just speed it up, to go back and hype what actually happened. Behind the glass loomed a vast hall of towering engines, so many that at first Mallory thought the walls must surely be lined with mirrors, like a fancy ballroom. It was like some carnival deception meant to trick the eye. The giant identical engines, clock-like constructions of intricately interlocking brass, big as rail cars set on end, each on its foot-thick padded blocks. I really don't think of myself as a predictive, extrapolative science fiction writer. I think of myself as I don't know, almost as a surrealist. I think that what I'm doing is taking a sort of hallucinatory, very impressionistic take on contemporary reality and presenting it as science fiction. Science fiction is my excuse for what I do rather than what I do. It's a flag of convenience to some extent.
Ben Woolley reporting there, and William Gibson's new book, The Difference Engine, is published by Galanx. Now Brian Griffin, his last major work, a photographic